And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to today's session. This is one of my all-time favorite topics to write about or present on. Well, simply put, it's because you don't have to be a programmer to make use of the extensibility tools in Office. And if you're an Office power user, those tools are some of the most powerful, most valuable tools you're probably not using. So, whenever I present to non-developers about tools that are commonly thought of as developer territory, there's a brief story I like to start with. It was several years ago that this happened. It was a friend of mine who at the time was actually a field salesperson for Microsoft, and she'd asked me over dinner one night about some frustration she'd had the evening before with a long report document. She'd pasted about 50 tables from an Excel workbook into a Word report document, a long report, and had to deliver it in the morning, so she needed to format all of those tables to match the document. Well, she's a power user. She used a table style. She even recorded a macro to do some of the repetitive work. But still, it took hours to get done. You know, there are differences between some of the tables that the recorded macro couldn't account for, that sort of thing. So it still took her hours. And she asked me if there was a faster, easier way. Felt like it should have been faster than that. Even though it may have only taken her 4 or 5 minutes a table, that really adds up fast. Well, of course, when I suggested VBA, she looked at me like I was from Jupiter. She's not a developer, doesn't want to be a developer, never read a line of programming code in her life, and really never thought she'd want to. But when I explained that, the reason I asked was if she knew just a few VBA basics, she could have accomplished what she needed to accomplish in a few minutes rather than several hours. And, well, as you can imagine, that changed her opinion of the desire in terms of her desire to learn VBA. Now, that's just one of a huge number of examples, of course, of how power users can utilize Office extensibility. Well, in today's session, we're going to look at how to use these tools to save time, to troubleshoot issues, and to customize content beyond what you can do from within the already incredibly powerful Office programs. Remember that these are actually features. You may not have used them before, you may not see them, but these are features or tools of Office. So they are there for you. But before we get started, I want to also give you a little bit more of an idea of what to expect today. If you've attended other sessions in this series, this is going to be a little bit different, how to go about this today. And I'd also like to find out a little bit about how you use Office so I can present a session that makes the most sense for you and keep that in mind. So I'm making some assumptions about your Office experience today, and you can see a few examples of those on this slide. Well, if any of those tasks or features aren't automatic for you, don't be concerned. Please do stay. Now, if you've attended my webcast in the past at this point, you've always heard me say that I believe everyone will be able to get something out of this session regardless of your level. Well, it's a bit different for today, and the choices I've made of what features to list here have two purposes to that end. I am assuming that you're experienced advanced Office users. If you're a beginner or intermediate user, it's great to see this stuff. It's great to see how far you'll be able to take Office if you choose to go there. But I want to be very honest and say that some of what I'm going to show you, if you are not an experienced user of Office, might be tough to follow. But at the same time, for advanced users, you might be amazed to see how much you already know about these programming languages that we're going to look at just because you know the features of the program and how to use them. And you'll see exactly what I mean as I get into the demo. But I chose the specific features that are listed here, both because they're examples of advanced content creation tasks, but also because some of them show you just how much you already do know going into today's session. Well, for example, if you've created a custom field code from scratch in Word, or you've customized one, like adding your own switches to a field code, well, you already know how to write one type of basic code. And the same goes for those of you who write custom formulas in Excel. So as we get, as we get going here, before we jump in, and I don't want to scare off anybody who feels that they may be less experienced. The reason that I stress this about being an advanced user is, before you know whether or not you need to go outside of the main Office program windows, right, the UI as we call it, the user interface, and into the developer tools or the extensibility tools, just like any other feature in Office, you always want to use the simplest solution for any task, right? And just because it's more advanced doesn't make it either more complex or more simple. You're going to use VBA or use Office OpenXML, only use those where they are the simplest solution. They shouldn't be a choice of either or. I can go into the document or I can break open under the hood and explore the XML. Well, a basic user or typical Office user shouldn't ever have to go under the hood if they don't want to, and certainly doesn't. So it's really important, I think, to be an experienced user so you know what features, what you can do within the programs before you go and venture beyond them, and know when so you can know when you're using the simplest solution for the task. Okay, that said, let's see. Let's learn a little bit about you guys. So I've got just a few quick polls for you, and they are all completely anonymous. You just click on the screen to give your answer. The first one is just how you view yourself as an Office user. So how would you rate your experience level with Microsoft Office? And please just go ahead and click on the screen, submit your answer. We'll take a look, again, completely anonymous. Just want to get an idea of the level of the folks in the room. We'll take just a second or two to do that. And okay, great. So it looks like we've got some professional Microsoft Office users in the room. We do have about half the people in the room are advanced users, power users. We do have a good portion of people who are describing themselves as intermediate users and some beginners. Thank you. I'm really glad there's nobody who doesn't use Microsoft Office who's here today. So for the folks who are beginners or intermediate users, you know what? Hopefully it'll be fun. Just like everybody else in the room, feel free to ask questions. I will be answering questions at the end of the session today, and if there's a lot of questions, I will answer those we don't have time for by email. I'm also going to give you guys a way to follow up and ask me questions that come up later. So I do hope you'll all get something out of this and explore the breadth of what you can do. Okay, two other quick questions. Want to find out if there's folks with programming experience in the room, and you certainly do not need it. This session is designed for advanced Office users who have never seen a line of programming code, who use it. So, so please answer. Feel comfortable answering. What experience, if any, do you have with any programming language? And there is no reason not to don't be concerned about putting none whatsoever if that is the case. We'll give everybody a minute there. And I promise you there's only one more of these. I just want to make sure that this session is as relevant as possible for as many people in the room as possible. Okay, so got a mix here, and I'm going to say I'm a little bit surprised. We've got a lot of professional and hobbyist developers in the room, and for those of you who are professional developers or hobbyist developers, if you are experienced, we've got some dabblers, some people at each level here. If you are an experienced developer, I'm still going to assume that you are here because either using VBA or Office OpenXML to extend the user capabilities of Office is the reason that you're here. So this session is designed for folks who are new to this stuff. So some of it may seem quite basic to you. And hopefully you will still have some fun with it. And the very last one, I promise you, very, very last one is just want to see what Office program you use most to create content and get a feel for, make sure that I'm doing something for if there's folks who are really focused on, I really hope she talks about, using OpenXML with PowerPoint, for example, whatever application interests you the most. And we'll just give that 1 second or two. All right, maybe a few seconds. Go ahead and click on your answer. Okay. All right. So it's really interesting because we've got a mix. We definitely have a mix of folks across the board. We've got a really heavy amount of Excel users, And that tends to be typical with folks who think they can go, extensibility. I think people who use Excel are more inclined toward that. You can create custom functions with Excel. It may be more natural or seem part of the process. I can tell you, the majority of what we're going to look at today are examples in Word and then PowerPoint. We're only going to touch on Excel for one small example, but everything I'm going to show you essentially today applies to all three. And I will talk about differences from one application to the other. And the reason is, I think one place where I like to focus or make very clear is it might seem less obvious. Well, why would I use VBA with Word or with PowerPoint or OpenXML as much as I might if I'm working in an Excel sort of structure? Well, there's lots of good reasons, and we're going to look at those. So hopefully that will be fun for everyone. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that, folks. And now, time to get down to business. All right. So since you chose to be here today, regardless of what level of experience you have, I'm thinking it's likely you may already have some idea of what you might want to do with either VBA or Office OpenXML. But let's differentiate those two very different tools and what you can expect of them. So VBA, or Microsoft Visual Basic for Applications, is a programming language that essentially enables you to automate features of the Office programs. Office OpenXML is the language behind the file formats that were introduced in Office 2007 and are still used in Office 2010, of course. For those of you who may be Mac Office users in the room, they were introduced in Office for Mac in Office 2008 for Mac and are still the formats in Office for Mac 2011. And those are the file formats with 4-character file extensions, as most of you probably know, like DocX or PPTX, right? Or if they have macros in them, they're macro enable filed, and so they end with an M instead of an X. And as you start writing VBA macros, that is a really important thing to keep in mind. You're going to want to make sure that you are saving macro enabled, or your macros are going to get lost. But Office will warn you loudly about that. It's not going to easily let you delete your macros. So that's not something to worry about. All right. So what can you do with these programs? Well, I'm going to give you some sort of oversimplified answers to those, but here's how I like to classify it. Now, you use VBA because VBA enables you to automate the features of Office. You use VBA to save time, such as by automating complex or repetitive tasks like the table, formatting 50 tables in a document as mentioned, or at a more advanced level, a developer may want to, if you create content for others to use, perhaps you're somebody who creates custom templates and such, you may want to automate those for people to use to help them create content more easily. Perhaps, or what I do for many of my clients is to create custom templates and automate them to help users throughout the organization create content that looks consistently on brand, right? So that's something that happens in a lot of organizations. There's a lot of ways, certainly a lot of ways to, when I say automating complex or repetitive tasks, that's enormously broad, from the most simple to extremely extensive solutions. You can also use it to troubleshoot, such as by getting information about your document that you can't see. Here's one example of that that came up for me not too long ago. A client of mine had an Excel workbook that was a monster. Now, it had been copied and changed from several versions, probably started in way back in Office 2000 or something of that sort, and has been copied and changed ever since, and they're using Office 2010 now. And it just has, all it's got is numbers, some formulas, some numbers. There's nothing else going on in there, but it was huge. It was several megabytes, and there was no apparent reason for it. And it crashed all the time just trying to edit basic content. Well, in VBA, just using exactly one line of code, I saw that there were, this is a fantastic number, over 200,000 shapes. Well, then I was able to do some more troubleshooting in OpenXML and see what in heaven's name those shapes could be. Well, if you've used Office 2010 graphics and you've seen the selection pane, you could have opened the selection pane on the worksheets to see what those shapes are. Or you can also do as I did and crack open the OpenXML, look at the document under the hood, and I saw these massive drawing objects, pulled them right out. It turned out that they were tiny empty text boxes, the kind that if you've used Office for a really long time, way back when, many, many versions ago when the web was pretty new and HTML content, copying HTML content into Office was pretty new, you may recall that if you pasted tables from the web into an Office program using certain formats or just default paste, you could get these tiny little empty graphic objects. Well, that's what they were. This document was so old, right, or this workbook rather, was so old and had been used so many times and so much copying and pasting that it had gotten all of these tiny little text boxes. And then using OpenXML, I was just able to pull that right out. Pull it right out in about 2 seconds, and it fixed the document, brought the size down, fixed the stability, and no more problems. Because with 200,000 shapes, it was even too heavy. It was too much even for VBA to be able to do because it just required so much system resources. So that's an example of troubleshooting how both VBA and OpenXML can work together for troubleshooting, and was able to do in a few minutes what might otherwise have either been impossible or taken at the very least hours or days to do. So an example of how you can use those tools for troubleshooting. Now, as I said, these examples I'm giving also, they're tremendous oversimplifications. There's so much you can do with these programs. I mean, from the add-ins and such that I've talked to, and you may have seen programs written with VBA as well. I've seen people use it to create just incredibly cool, fun things as well, like even games, right? These are powerful, powerful programming tools that can be super simple for a lot of things you want to accomplish, some of which we'll look at today, and can get incredibly powerful. So for example, you might use OpenXML to explore, to customize content beyond what you can do in the UI. Like if you use themes, if you use document themes in Word, PowerPoint, or Excel to format content, well, you use a theme color palette probably, and you see that there's tints and shades of your theme colors. But what if you want a different tint or shade that's not in that palette, but you still want that color to respond to themes, right? So if the theme has changed, it should still update. You can do that with one line of markup, just one line of markup. In OpenXML, and I'll talk about this, it's called markup instead of code, but it really means the same thing. You'll hear me use that term, and I'll explain it when we get into the demo. So you can do customization beyond what you can do in the UI. If you use themes, another example, well, you can create custom theme colors in Office. You can create custom theme fonts, but what about custom theme effects? Well, you can do that with OpenXML. We'll take a look at another example of how to easily customize SmartArt graphic layouts as well. So, of course, there's only so much I can show you about 2 different programming languages, 2 enormous, massive topics in one short demo. I want to say up front, I am not going to try to teach you how to perform any specific tasks. My intention for today is to show you the basics of how to access VBA and Office OpenXML, the basics of how to read each, how they're written, how they're organized, and then I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how each one is used to give you some idea of how easy it can be to do. And I'll give you some additional resources from that point of where you can go to learn the tasks that I'm showing you and many more, and where you can get started and take it further. So we need to get into the demo before I can do any of that. And so as we get into the demo, I just want to mention a couple of quick things about screen sharing. It's common for the video or the audio to lag with screen sharing software. And it's really impossible for me to know if that's happening to you, because it's going to vary based on each person's internet connection, system resources, all that stuff. So if it feels like I'm jumping around on the screen, I promise I'm not going to do that to you. But do keep in mind that you can ask questions if you miss something, and you can return to the recorded version of the session later, as mentioned, to review anything that you miss. Just a reminder, no matter when you ask your question, I'm going to answer the questions at the end of the session or follow up by email depending on how our time goes. But every question will get answered. And and you can, as I mentioned, you can always reach out to me later as well through my terribly neglected blog. That is, I'll give you the information later, but if you want to jot it down now, the address is arrowway.net, AROUET.net, and you can use the click to contact link there to send me a question. I also want to mention, if you have my latest book, which is for Office 2010 as well as Office for Mac 2011, it's called Documents, Presentations, and Workbooks. That book contains extensive primers on both VBA and Office OpenXML, both of which are written specifically for advanced Office users with zero previous programming experience. So, okay. Shameless plug is officially done. We can go ahead and get started. It does take a minute for me to get into the screen share, folks. Should also mention that everything I'm going to be showing you today, as well as a good deal more, is available in that book in a great deal more detail as well. So, sorry, folks, bear with me. And unfortunately, I have to set this up manually each time, and so I apologize for keeping you waiting, but it's going to be there in just a second. And here we are. Okay, so we're going to start talking about VBA. We'll spend some time in VBA, and then we will switch over to Office OpenXML. So we're going to start by recording a macro in Word VBA, something pretty simple, and take a look at how VBA is written, what it is, right, how it's structured. So this example is actually in the book. If you've looked at the VBA primer already, you may have seen it, and it's what it starts off with, or a very similar one. So I'm creating a new PitchBook document here is the scenario, and if you've ever used a PitchBook document, or created a PitchBook, PitchBooks are typically, they're marketing documents, and they're often set up with the same set of headings at the top of each page. They're very modular, and sometimes they're created in Word, sometimes in PowerPoint. Every page will have the same set of headings, right, of heading styles, and then text, and they can be pretty complex documents, and they can be really, really long and have a ton of images. So let's say that I've already set up my styles, so because my headings 1, 2, and 3 are the headings at the top of every page, so I've customized the style so that style for the following paragraph for heading 1 is already set to be heading 2, and you can see that in the pop-up here in the style definition, the last line there. Following style is heading 2, and heading 2 is automatically going to give me the following style of heading 3 when I hit enter, and then heading 3 will go back to normal because that's my body text. So I'm going to record a macro to set up that top of the page so that I can use that when I create each new page, right? So, and you might do that sort of thing already. So I'm going to click to record a macro, and we'll call this, well, set up page, and we'll save it to the default. Click on heading 1, and maybe all of the headings in my document start with the same intro, or maybe that's first section, so I'll type it. And I'm going to press enter to get heading 2, enter to get heading 3, and enter to get a normal body text. And then I want to move my insertion point back up to where I'm going to start typing that heading. All right, let's close this. Now, if I want to go ahead and look at this macro that I've just recorded, I can go to the Developer tab and click Visual Basic to open the Visual Basic Editor, which is where we're going to do most of our VBA work today. Or I can use, if you use shortcut keys, Alt F11. Alt F11 is a big favorite of mine, and it's because not only is it is a shortcut, and I happen to love keyboard shortcuts, but even if you don't, there's a big benefit, especially if you're going to use VBA in multiple programs at once. F11 is going to toggle you between the application window and the VBA window for that program. The VBA window looks almost identical in each program. It'll have the application icon here in the top left corner. But other than that, it's pretty easy to get confused where you are. You can see there will be differences, and we'll talk about what these windows are. There'll be differences certainly once you pay attention, but if you're working in multiple programs in VBA, it's really nice to have that toggle so you know you're in the right place. All right, so let's look at this macro that we just recorded. And this main window area right here is called the code window, and that's where you're going to see where you can either write and edit your macros, or where you're going to see your recorded macros. And over here on the left, this is the Project Explorer, and it's going to show you all of your open documents or presentations or workbooks, and it's going to show you whatever code elements are in there. I'm not going to explain all of the details of what's in this window right now, because that would take all of the time that we have today. But by default, if you happen to be recording a macro in Word and you save it to the default location, it's going to go into your normal .m template, and it's it's going to go into a module, a code module, which is pretty much the equivalent of a document, right? It's a VBA equivalent of a document, and it will contain several procedures. So if we think about the syntax here, basically a macro is a procedure, is an individual procedure. There are multiple types of procedures, so it's not completely synonymous, but a macro is a procedure. You can have multiple procedures inside a module, and then multiple modules and other types of content like dialog boxes, which are called user forms, and other sorts of content that can be contained within a project, and that's why that's the Project Explorer. So the project is the document or template, or the workbook or template, or add-in, right, as the case may be, PowerPoint, the presentation or template or add-in that you are using. That is the project. Properties window shows you the name and lets you change the name of the module. If you're in a user form, you're going to see tons of properties there. If you use the old legacy form fields and ActiveX controls, you may be familiar with complex properties windows that show you objects, a range of objects, and that's what that's about. You don't really have to worry about that for just working with simple macros. And then down here is the immediate window, which I'm going to close for the moment. It's actually one of my very favorite things, and we will spend some time there shortly. But we're going to close it so it's just not in our way. Okay, so what am I saying here? If you've never seen a line of before, the most important thing to know, I think, about the basics of VBA, Rita, there's two things. One is what I mentioned in the introduction today. If you are an experienced user of Office, you already know so much of the language just because you know the features. It's going to be extremely intuitive to you. The underlying core structure of VBA is identical across programs, and it all comes from the Visual Basic language, Visual Basic for applications. So Visual Basic for Word, for Excel, for PowerPoint are going to differ by the types of content they can act on, right? You see type paragraph here. You see styles, which was referring to Word styles. You see a term like active document, right? That's a Word document. You're going to see comparable terms in Excel and PowerPoint, active workbook, active presentation. But the underlying structure, the types of things that you can do, and the way the code is structured is identical across all three. So if you have no interest in Word, if you're interested in Excel, if you're interested in PowerPoint, this is just as applicable to you. The specific pieces of content may not be, but the underlying basics, that is what we're really looking at here, certainly are 100%. So just like, in English language made up of sentences, right? A basic statement is a sentence that is made up of nouns, verbs, and descriptors like adjectives. Okay, same thing in VBA. What you'd call a sentence in English is called a statement in a line of code, and that is one line of code, right? It may wrap to multiple lines, but it is actually just one line of code, regardless of the length. A statement always contains it's going to contain an object, and it must contain either a method or a property. Think an object is like a noun, right? A thing you act upon. It must contain an object, in this case, the selection object. That means my active selection. That's what it's acting upon, the selection object. Then it must contain either an action, right, a verb, which is called a method in VBA. So like a verb in English, a method in VBA is an action, or a property in VBA, which would be the equivalent really of an adjective. It's a descriptor. And that may be, right, you see examples of that here. You may have both in some cases, but you always have to have an object and then either a property or a method. So selection is my object, and style is an attribute of that. It's a property of that object, right? The style is a property of that object, so this first line of code is that first action I took, which was to set the style property for the active paragraph. Where my insertion point was clicked, that's my selection. I set the style as the heading 1 style. So in this document, style named heading 1 is what I want to apply to this selection. The next line of code is an object and a method. Selection is the object, and the action or method, type text. And this is the text that I typed specifically. Type paragraph. Each time I hit enter, selection, type paragraph, object, and method. Very simple statements. The rest of these are all methods. They're actions. Now, it's interesting when you record a macro, we talked about that example with my friend and her tables in the long document. Well, if you record a macro, the reason she was so limited and recording a VBA macro didn't make things so much faster for her is because you can't account for differences from one table to the next. There's a lot that you can't do because when you're recording a macro, you're always acting on the selection, always, right? When you write or edit macros, the essential, basic, simplified version of what's the difference, you don't have to select something to act on it when you write a macro. And that gives you a tremendous amount more power because I don't have to, first of all, it can make macros run more quickly, but something this short and simple for a macro isn't going to take a long time to run. But what it does is it lets me specify what I want to act on. So you can loop through a bunch of content. Tell it every time you find a paragraph that says X, apply such and such style. Well, you can do that particular example with find and replace. But let's say I wanted to set up an entire document, right? Every time someone creates a new pitch book, they need to set up 30 pages with the same heading and the same set of styles. Well, maybe you would do that in a template, but maybe it doesn't make sense to because there's a bunch of variables, right? Maybe it doesn't make sense to set that up as a template because it could be one of 50 different setups, and you can specify those through VBA. So there could be a number of reasons why it makes more sense to go into VBA to do something. You can also see from those examples why it's important to know what features are available because it might be a lot faster and simpler to use the features that are in the program. But when I use VBA, let's go over to, I'm going to walk through and take a look at some other macros that are here. This module that I just switched to, Primer Macros, is actually included as part of the bonus content in my Office 2010 book. So if you have that book, you have this module. You can check it out and use it for yourself. And this particular Primer Macros is actually all of the sample macros that are used throughout the VBA primer in the book. There's also another sample macros template that has a bunch of other example macros. But this actually is some of the stuff that's in the book. So for example, there's a couple of different things about writing versus recording a macro that make a difference. If you look at this grouping sample right here, the macro called grouping sample. So sub, by the way, let's talk about syntax a little more. Sub refers to subroutine, which is the formal name for a macro. So my subroutine, my procedure here. For a procedure, rather, your names can't have spaces. So I've called this grouping sample, and this just shows you an example of I'm actually acting on the selection here. This macro is exactly the macro that we looked at before in just much less lines of code, right? I was able to group it and say, with my selection, I want to do all of these things on and act on my selection, apply this style, then type this text and type a bunch of hard returns. That's VBCR stands for VB carriage return. That's an example. We're going to go down to, we talked about looping through different kinds of content, right? So an example of a loop, let's say I had 50 tables in a document and I just wanted to apply the same table style. Well, as much as that doesn't take a huge amount of time, right, I could still do that with just a couple of lines here. This is super simple, and you can see how I might want to do a bunch of things each time I got there. So we're not going to go into all the details of each line of this code, but DIM stands for dimension, which is sort of declare. We're using variables. We're using different types of terminology. If this is all brand new to you, don't worry about that. All we're doing is establishing that we're going to use the term ATB as a short way to refer to tables. So for every table in active document.tables, which is the collection of all tables in the document, to that table, I want to apply this table style. And it's going to just loop through automatically and hit every one of those tables. So imagine that you could also tell it to do 6 other things. You can also have conditional statements, right? If, then, else, you may have used field codes. In Word, you may have used Excel formulas, right, and conditional statements. Same thing in VBA. You can use mathematical operators, exactly the same sort of thing as well. So you could use a conditional statement to say, well, if my table has 4 columns and less than 6 rows, then I always want to do this set of steps. But if it has 5 columns and 8 set of rows, because that defines a different type of table in my particular document, then I want to perform a different set of steps. And you can put that into a macro, click, and it runs the whole document at the same time. So you see how instead of having to instead of having to select and click, you can use really basic syntax and things like that, like these different types of looping statements, right? A very simple loop for each style in the collection of styles in this document, right? That's a little oversimplified, right? Am I going to go through and delete every style? Well, I can't delete styles that there are going to be some styles I'm not able to delete in a document. Again, these are all of the examples that are in the primer, so some of them may not stand on their own. But you can see how you can perform an enormous amount of action with a tremendously little amount of work. And all of those things, loops, conditional statements, grouping statements, the same concept of object property method, all of those things apply to any of the programs that you can automate with VBA. Main difference is what the available objects, properties, and methods. So where tables may be an object in all 3, because there's tables in Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. And I say all 3 because that's what the examples that I'm giving, but do keep in mind that you can use VBA is available in many of the Office programs, not all of which for content creation, but you can use VBA for extensibility in Outlook, in Access, in Visio, in Publisher. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. In most of the Office programs. So and the underlying concepts, the basics that you can learn, will apply to each one of those. Okay. So the last thing that I want to show you in VBA, and in a little bit later, I told you it's very difficult to be able to show enough, is I talked about the immediate window. Well, the immediate window, I gave that example of using the immediate window to see if there were shapes. I wanted to see if there were drawing objects, because that seemed a logical thing to me in that massive workbook of my clients that might have been creating a bunch of space, because sometimes a floating object, you might not see it right in front of you, because maybe it's been pushed somewhere that it's not visible. So I used the immediate window to count the number of shapes in that workbook. Well, you can use the immediate window for a lot of different things, and one of my favorite super simple examples is something that has frustrated users of Excel for a really, really long time, and that is if I press Control-End here in that book, notice where it put my insertion point way down here. That is what Excel considers the used range of my document, of my worksheet rather, just because at some point I use that content over there. It's not there anymore. If you've ever run into the frustration with, well, just deleting content from there doesn't do it. You can delete rows, delete columns to get rid of it, but sometimes it seems to be extremely difficult to get it to actually let you, if I'm going to try to select my worksheet and just select the used range, it's really tough to get that to reset. Well, it doesn't have to be. So instead of fussing and fighting with it, I'm going to use Alt F11, and go into the Excel VBA editor. In the immediate window, if you don't see it, you can get it on the view menu. Or as you see here, Control-G is the shortcut. That is not a toggle. Control-G will always place your insertion point in the immediate window. It's not a toggle. To reset that range, I type active sheet, which is the object, and used range. Press Enter. Let's toggle back. Control-End. No fuss, no muss, no fighting. Okay. Have one other quick example. I create a lot of custom themes. If you create custom content, if you work with graphics at all, this is a really good example. Well, that is something that has been invaluable for me. I create custom themes all the time, and that means creating and customizing slide layouts and masters. So I've got a custom layout in this particular template called Custom Content with Table, and I'm going to go to that custom layout. Sorry, folks. Sorry, folks. My window's gotten all stretched out and does not want to behave right at the moment. Bear with me. There we go. It's going to readjust. Sorry about that. So, whoop. I closed my... It's giving me a hard time, folks, in getting back my, I'm having a hard time in getting what I want to be able to show you here. So bear with me in the interest of time. I'm going to skip that example and just tell you about it. What I was going to show you, and if anyone wants to see this, I will, if anyone wants to see this, I can send you an example. I can post it on my blog in follow-up. Just let me know. But if you're positioning content, in graphics content, particularly sort of PowerPoint content, if you're positioning things on custom layouts, you may have noticed that you can position or size something to 1/100 of an inch if you're working in U.S. English measurements or comparable in metric system, right? So 1/100 of an inch. And that might seem really precise, but if you create custom templates and themes and you know it's not very precise at all, when you need to get more precise than that, you can use the immediate window to ask the exact width, height, position from left, position from top, and then apply it to another object. So if you're trying to create identical positioning for different types of objects from one layout to the next, you can get much more precise and have a much better result just by using the immediate window. Super simple. All right. Sorry for that little technical snafu, folks, but let's go ahead and spend a few minutes in Office OpenXML before we run out of time. So as mentioned in the introduction, right, so Office OpenXML, that's the language underneath the file formats, right, the language in which the Office 2010 and Office for Mac 2011 file formats are written. Office OpenXML is a form of XML. It is a markup language. If you've read HTML source code for a web page ever or seen that, then you've seen something like this. It is very plain language. It is descriptive. XML is a language that describes data. Office OpenXML you can both describe and act on data. And we'll give you some examples. Let's give you some examples, but let's take a look at some of the basics. So first of all, at the very simplest, right, let's go ahead and take a look at this excuse me, I'm in the wrong place. Bear with me, folks. Sorry. Okay. So if I am just in, it could not be a simpler document, right? Here is some text in my simple basic text document. Let's see what that document looks like under the hood. If you have no developer tools, if you have no tools whatsoever except what comes with Windows and Office, you can just go into the folder in Windows. And if you want to look at the content under the hood, change the extension to zip, because every Office OpenXML file is a compressed collection of files and folders, just like a zip folder. Change the extension to zip and you can open it. There's much more efficient ways to do this so you don't have to change that extension back and forth. But if I now unzip that, I see that document is actually a collection of folders and files within each one. Okay. If you do not have any tools, you can extract those files. You can open XML files in a web browser like Internet Explorer to see its structure. You can open for editing. You can open it just in the default Windows Notepad or any text editor. Now it's really important, Mac users, keep in mind you cannot use the built-in archive utility. If you extract those files from the zip to re-archive, it's going to put hidden Mac-specific files that will corrupt the document. But there are plenty of tools that you can use to do that, and there's also ways to be able to see those files through third-party tools. So if you're interested in that, do let me know. If you do have the book, that's also explained, and there's resources on that as well. But let's take a look at a couple of simple solutions. So here's one. There's a number of freeware and shareware tools that can allow you to look at and act upon the content in an OpenXML document without changing the extension. One of my favorites for that is a third-party tool called 7-Zip. 7-zip.org is their website. I point to 7-Zip and open archive, and that is going to show me the contents. unlike changing the extension to zip, which is going to be read-only on a Windows machine, and of course on Mac OS, you're going to need to unarchive using the built-in, if you're using the built-in tools, to be able to access and see the content. With 7-zip, it's not read-only, it's read-write. So you can open individual files and parts and view them and edit them. Well, you can view them from the zip package, but edit them and update them in the package without having to extract everything and put it back. So that can be a very simple time saver. If you have what we're going to do for our purposes here, I will come back to 7-zip for one task I want to show you. But quickly, just to show you the package, I have Visual Studio 2010 here. It's a little bit easier to see that code. So I'm going to open this document there so you can see all the pieces, and then we'll see the code. If you have Visual Studio 2010, there's an OpenXML, there's a power tool for opening Office OpenXML documents in this way. I will make sure that's in additional resources in the follow-up post that I will post next week on my blog once we have the link for the recorded version of this session. So if you want that, this is an incredibly useful tool. If you have Visual Studio, you certainly don't need to have it to be able to edit OpenXML documents. As mentioned, you can even just change the extension to zip, extract it, and use Notepad, or if you're on Mac OS, use TextEdit. Just make sure that you safely re-archive that so that no extra files are added. All right, so let's take a look at, we saw that this is some text. I'm going to take a look at, if I open the Word folder, now back to that. We talked about there's people here who are looking for different types of content, right? What is in this, oh, let's look at this way. Okay, so this is what we saw when we opened the zip package. You've got doc props, document properties, right? Language is very, very plain language. Word is going to be the main folder, the main document folder in a Word documents package. It's called PPT in PowerPoint. It's called Excel in an Excel file. And underscore rels, R-E-L-S, is a relationships, right? So it's a relationships folder. It's going to look a little bit different here in Visual Studio than it'll look. I'll show you again what it looks like if you just open it in a zip package. But the basic pieces, relationships, super important. So what is this? This shows you document properties in the document. What does that mean? Let's take a look and see some of those document properties. If you are using Visual Studio, by the way, to edit, I use Control-K, Control-D, or Control-KD to be able to structure that OpenXML part when I opened it. So you can see this shows me the properties, right? Creator or author, it would be called in your Office document. Last modified by. I'm creating some templates. I don't want my name to remain in them, so I've changed that to just a space rather than a name. That's why you're seeing that there. Number of revisions. There may be much more information. Well, what does this tell you? XML, one of the biggest benefits of it also is security and troubleshooting and accessibility. That's more than one, right? But the idea is everything's compartmentalized, and you can access everything in very plain language. So, think about concerns over metadata and hidden content and stuff that wasn't visible to the end user, that you needed to do a lot of checking to know what you were sending out in a document. Well, there's plenty of tools in Office that help you with that now, and it's much easier to do because everything is accessible, everything is visible. And that clarity also makes it a lot easier to program against, right, to automate, to customize, because you can get to and work with content much more easily. All right, so my dot properties there. Relationships, there's a defined relationships for every part in the document. What does that mean? Those relationships are telling the document how to put these pieces together to make a document. And that's why they're so important. We're going to take a look at just some basic structure here. So I'm opening document XML, which is the content of the main body of a Word document. And the structures are a little bit different. We're looking at Word because it's actually the simplest of the three in terms of that structure. PowerPoint is going to be separated into slides. Layouts, masters are each going to have their own parts. You'll see in Excel you have different parts for worksheets versus what's managed by the workbook itself. So not more difficult. That's the whole thing, is if you're experienced users, you know the program, you know this stuff. It's just it's automatic. You can see it and know where to look, right? But Word is pretty simple and straightforward. Whether you're a heavy Word user or not, this is going to be pretty clear. Notice, again, this is a markup language. So you turn on a code, you turn off a code. Everything is sort of nested, right? The codes are nested one within another. So you see at the outermost we have the document. You've got a prefix. It's always going to be W. Well, I'll talk to you about exceptions, but the prefix in Word by default is W for Word, of course. And that's Word document. So everything that's nested, you see Word document and then / Word document. That / is the off part of the tag. They're paired tags. You may call them codes, right? The same sort of codes, paired codes. If you use field codes in Word, it's a similar kind of a concept, right? Again, if you've seen HTML source code, you can turn on, or if you've ever played around with a rich HTML editor they have on some sort of social networking sites where you can bold something by using B and then /B, that sort of thing. Exactly the same kind of concept, right? So within the document, we then have the body of the document. Don't worry about the stuff that's up there at the top. We then have the body of the document. Within the body of the document, we have the collection of paragraphs, W:(P), Word paragraph. Within an individual paragraph, we have a run of text or a run of content, W:(R) for run, and that is a piece of content that shares the same formatting. So WT, you probably guessed, Word text. Here is some text. Right? And then if you go down a little bit further after the paragraph, right, the paragraph ends, notice that nested paragraph. You've got nested tags. They're paired tags on. We start the paragraph, we end the paragraph, and everything in between. Section properties, WSectPR, Word section properties. Page size, page margins, columns, right? It's one column, it's the same, right? It's going to be the width. Notice that these are all very clear. In terms of the numeric terminology, different programs and different features use different types of numeric units to calculate values. If you have the book in the Office Open XML Primer, there's a distinct list of that. I've got articles online for those of you who don't have the book. If you need to know the different measurement units that are used for different types of content, let me know that. I can post an online reference to that for you as well. There is tons of content available online on both VBA and Office Open XML, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, or probably in a follow-up post as I look at the time here. So you can see how easy it is to read that, right, to read that XML. Of course, there's much more that I'd like to show you, but I want to talk about two very quick examples rather than going into more of how the markup looks, right? Talk about a couple of things that you can do with it. Well, one of my favorite things, actually, is what can you do with OpenXML without even reading or writing a line of code? And what webcast would be complete without a picture of my cat? Really, it just wouldn't. So this is an example where, let's say you've got a document, a huge document, that has a client's logo in it about 100 different times, right? It's about to go out by courier when you learn the client has a new logo. And that's going to be really embarrassing. Maybe it's a pitch. Maybe it's a pitch document, and you've used their logo throughout your design. And how in the world are you going to change that 100 different times and format it and place it and size it everywhere it needs to go? Wouldn't it be nice if you could copy and paste it once into the document and it would automatically go where it needs to go and automatically know how to size and format? Well, that's what you can do without a single line of code in XML. Here's an example. So I've got the same picture, two different sizes, two different types of formatting, right? One's even in the header and one's in the body. If I'm going to use WinZip to open that archive and see that document, in the Word folder, if there's pictures, I've got media. Notice there's just one picture there. Well, here I have another picture of the same format, right? I don't even have to tell the document that I'm using a different format. which is why I don't need code. If it's a different file format, a different picture type, you would need to write a little XML. There's an article about how to do this that I wrote that's online right now, so I can give you that. Will be one of the follow-up additional resources that I give you step-by-step on how to do that if it's the same file type as well as different. All I have to do is copy and paste that. Notice I just used the 7-zip tool there. You don't need a tool like Visual Studio. And when I replace the document, oh, isn't that sweet? Now they're snuggling. And it kept the formatting and it kept the size. Literally, one thing to keep in mind if you're going to try that, it's also going to keep the proportions. So if the first picture was wide and shallow and the second one is tall and narrow, it will be distorted. But guess what? You can use a simple VBA macro to fix that throughout the document. So tools can save you an enormous amount of time. Not going to have time to show you the last example I wanted to, which was going to be how to use OpenXML to customize SmartArt layouts, like if I wanted to use this org chart but with a different shape. I could change shape, right? We talked about this before. I could select all of the objects and use change shape, but then when I add a new object, when I add a new shape to the diagram, it's going to go back to the shape saved in the layout. Not if I change it in the OpenXML, and that's super easy to do. Again, have an article that walks you through how to do that step by step. So I'm going to get out of the demo right now and see if we have any questions before we need to run away. Today, and then I can get you all of that information. Lots of walkthroughs, step-by-steps for how to do all the stuff I've talked about today. Got a number of articles to refer you to and more information. So I'm going to turn it back over to Yaz for a minute, and we'll see if we have some questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We do have a few questions that have come in, and we'll just take a couple due to time, folks. We have a question from Marcus. Marcus asks, I do some calculations in Excel every 5 or 10 seconds while the VBA code does this. The copied content is in the clipboard. So if I try to copy with another program something while the code runs, I'm not able to use a clipboard. Any suggestions?
Okay, I got to tell you, Marcus, I'm reading your question as much as Yaz is turning it, and I'm not quite clear on what you're saying. It sounds like you're saying that you want to be doing something you want to be doing another action while code is running, but need to ask a little bit more about that. I'm going to follow up with you by email to make sure that I'm clear on your question, because I don't think that I am. So can we go on to the next one? And Marcus, I promise to follow up with you by email and we can chat about it.
Perfect. Okay, next question. Can I connect a macro to a desktop shortcut key? I want to be able to activate the macro while the Office applications are closed.
Well, no, VBA is within a specific application, right? So that's going to be a different kind of programming. So you can't, I'm not going to be able to, you're talking about something presumably like Windows E opens the Windows Explorer. In Word, you can attach a macro to a shortcut key, even the ones that you record. You can also put you can also attach macros within Word, PowerPoint, or Excel to the ribbon. You can customize the ribbon. You can customize the quick access toolbar and make those available. If you want to make them available from outside the application, that is going to require a different type of script or a different type of program to access that code. You can't do that from within the programs.
Okay, one final question that we can take. Is it possible to use VBA to program for InfoPath? InfoPath is XML based, and InfoPath is a really powerful developer tool. It's a whole different thing. I know very little about the programming backend of InfoPath, but it is a favorite tool of developers, such as using forms development for working with SharePoint. There is a lot that you can do in customization, but it is not VBA. Okay, very good. Oh, and just one very final one. We're getting a lot of them. People hear that VBA is going away. Is that true?
What I have been told is that Microsoft is committed to VBA. Absolutely. In fact, if you're a Mac user, you know they took it out in Office 2008 and they brought it back. And in fact, just a quick note for any Mac users who aren't on the call, if you're using a program a version earlier than Office 2008, then a fair amount of what we talked about is not applicable. VBA on the Mac side was a little bit behind earlier. It went away. Now it is much better on the Mac side and a whole heck of a lot more compatible. But on the side, no, neither one. I absolutely no reason to think any such thing. So, thanks. And I do also want to say, for the people who asked questions where I answered in the negative or said you need something else or it's a different language, please feel free to go to my blog and click that, click to contact and follow up with me if you want to discuss more or ask more about that or talk more about that, and I can give you resources for the kind of thing you're talking about too.